and welcome to All Things Conflict. Today I'm taking a bit of a risk. I'm bringing my husband on the show, and he is a mediator and my business partner and the love of my life. And we've worked together for more years than I care to remember. We've been married for 10 years. We've been together for over 15 years. And we have grown together. So today, David is going to talk about his three-generation family business that he was managing director of before we met, and his whole journey through that and into being a mediator. So look, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you. Well, David, my husband, my business partner, love of my life. It feels really funny being here when we were like just doing the washing up a few minutes ago. And it's quite interesting, isn't it, to live and work together. I really wanted to invite you into this series, and depending on how well we do, invite you back again and again. Either that or divorce.
That's a different podcast.
That's a different podcast. But I really wanted, because you were the managing director of a three-generation family business, and this series is about, conflict within the sort of leadership, within business, at the sort of director level, founders, all that sort of thing. And I thought that it would be really good if you could just introduce some of that life and, the kinds of conflicts that went on and sort of some of the conclusions before you made that decision to change career, which we'll come on to later.
Okay. The family business was at the heart of the business. It was it was always at the point of conversation and distress and joy. The business was set up by my grandfather. We think somewhere in the 50s, and he was a very charismatic man's man, and he was just a man with such presence and such understanding in the way he could talk to people and get to the point quickly, that he was a very good salesman. And what he did is he bought the rights to football club programs, and he would sell the space, and if he sold more than the costs, he would make a profit. And then his name was Harry the Horse. And if I understand it from the little I know about our family, is he was a gambler, and at the end of every day he would go and put it on the horses, and that would dictate how early he got up and how much he worked the next day. And there were many people like him who didn't fit into the new industrial and commercial world, that had great personalities. They were all over the country, and bit by bit he built up different contracts with different football clubs around the country and had his band of followers, because that's what they were. They loved him. They adored him. He was Harry the Horse. He was the man, and he was incredibly charismatic. He was the man you just didn't say no to anything. And that's how he began. Unfortunately, he became ill. He had a heart condition, and my father was brought in to take over the business. He was a very different personality. I think for him, his experience of living boom and bust set him on a path of looking for stability. And he looked at it very differently. He realised there was a system. There was actually a system, and if you didn't go out and spend it every day and you retained someone, you could actually turn it into a business. So he built a system and a process. And with the change of generations of the partners, my grandfather had a partner, so their son and him, they moved into the next generation, and they worked the business in a very different way, but they built it. The world changed, the media changed, and then started coming in all the different laws, tax, penalties. It's a wonderful story. I'll put it in, you might edit it out. The lovely story of when my grandfather was doing the books and the tax man came along, and obviously he'd gambled all the money away. So the story is he just threw the ink all over the books and said, now what are you going to do about it? But those days ended. And my father was upset. We were always clearing up what Grandpa did, even in my time. He was a man of his own heart and his own mind, and he saw no limits. So my father contained the business, and then bit by bit, as we saw employment law, trading laws, consumer laws, we moved away from what was a really, I always think of it, a very sunny period. It was all done by word of mouth. There were no such things as contract. It was if Mr. Harry said he signed an order, they would pay for it. Then we moved into the next era. And my father built it very much piece by piece into a process, a system that very cleverly took a craft and an art and turned it into something that was very human and worked, because it worked for everyone. And we built a team, became a much larger national business. We then took over the printing, which gave us a sense of legitimacy. We weren't just those scumbags going out every day accused of ripping everyone off. The business wasn't like that, I believe, and I was part of it. We were what I call the last of the gentleman salesmen in the old world before it changed, and it was lovely. It really was lovely on the surface. Then what happened is my father retired. I took over the business. We moved into a much more technological age. Computers had started to come along. The dreaded Apple Mac came along. It changed everything, and the world began to change. I think my style was I was still working with some of the men and women from the 50s. And they were still thinking they were in the Wild West. And my job really was just, working with them to try and figure out what was the stunt going to be this week. And it wasn't because they were bad or nasty. It was a game. It was all part of the fun of selling, testing limits, having fun and enjoying it. It was a different world. So for me, and then what happened is when we met is we were coming into the age of telephone selling. We were moving away from direct selling. I started to look at the new people who might come into the business, and I thought I had problems. Wow. So I found it was a different generation with a different view, and that in the end the internet brought it to an end. So for all the kind of gloss and the glory of Harry the Horse and my father, who I still today marvel at what he did and how he did it, what he learned, how he developed it. It was a fabulous model. And I was able to continue it. What I learned across that in any business is the core of any business is the people that you have working with you, not for you, but with you. And their families, their lives, their storybook is actually more important in helping keep a group of people together that we can choose to trade together than anything else, as I saw it move across, depressions, change of technology and everything else.
Thank you. That's really lovely to listen to and to hear that whole thread through the generations. And we are here, David, to talk about, conflict in all these things. And maybe, I've heard you say a couple of times it all looked good on the surface, and all of that. And so maybe just before we move on, you could sort of talk about those kinds of conflicts that probably are still reflected today.
Yeah, the underlying conflicts were highly toxic, lasted generations, never went away. They never got resolved. It was one of my greatest disappointments when I ran the business, which I used to say to guys, why are we still here? Why are we still having these conversations 50 years later? And it was a shame. The underlying family difficulties, often people's response to life is taken to work, their difficulties they have to survive, but often a lot of their personal, emotional difficulties play out in work. The family was always in dispute. The partners were always in dispute. It had a very dark side to it of mistrust, of double dealing. The internal structures, when we started bringing people in, they got very confused. They didn't understand. Suddenly the managing director disappeared for a month and had a fit, or suddenly they were screaming and throwing things at each other. I remember once my father and I were having an argument, and we had a window outside our office, and there were a line of salesmen ready for the interview. And he and I were, in those days, it was paper and files, and we were throwing these things. It was fun. I mean, I can still remember that fight. I was having fun. I was just tweaking his ear. He just annoyed me. But we both lost it that day, and we were throwing files at each other. And half an hour later, we couldn't understand why no one was ready for an interview. Everyone left. So there's an example. But underneath it, there was a much darker element of distress, upset, mistrust that never got dealt with, and then often our own difficulties, emotional, fed into our ability and the way in which we ran the business, and sometimes we just didn't run it well. We just didn't, and sometimes we ran it fantastically, and I think it confused a lot of people, it confused a lot of suppliers, and it caused a great deal of unhappiness. So, often, I would look at the world, and it was one of the reasons I came out of it. It was that I had a life where on the surface I was very successful. I lived in the right place, I had the right car, I went to the right places, everything was lovely on the surface, and I was sad, depressed, and I couldn't understand why I couldn't function well.
Thank you. So I heard I'm just going to pick up on one point before I move us on a bit, if that's okay, David. And I heard you talk about the difference, and it doesn't matter whether it was your grandfather or your father, whatever. But for me, it resonated in the sort of things that we want to talk about in this series. And that is the difference between one person's cycle who lives on boom and bust, and another person who's desperate to find safety and security and consistency, and how that can create tensions between people.
Yes, I mean, where it showed up in this particular business was it was an ongoing fight between the contract managers, production managers, and the salesman, and me, because I was the salesman's head. And what I always explained to the production managers and to the contract managers, you do not get paid unless those salesmen sell. They are the business. So we need to accommodate and look after our salesmen and listen to their feedback and how they work. But then production looks at it in a very different way. It says, we need you to work towards our systems and processes that we love and protect, because we want to make them perfect and clean, and we want them to run simply, because the more simply the better they run. The truth is, the easier our jobs are, and the more we understand what we're doing, and then we can contain costs. When you come to the contract managers, it's risk and reputation. When we're going out selling under the banner of whether it was a football club or a chamber of commerce or a charity, and some of our salesmen could have very creative moments, and it was very hard to explain to whether it was the Office of Fair Trading or this was just a joke. No one went out to do anything. It was just a bit of fun they wanted to do, and my job was to try and keep the salesman calm and straight enough. Do you know what you're doing today? If I left the salesman alone for more than a few weeks, we wouldn't be selling advertising. We'd be selling used cars, signage. It would fascinate me how they would move into something else so quickly. So the constant shift and different psychologies was what I was always managing, and there's an unspoken reality which is still true today. If you go out into the world and you talk to people, it isn't always going to work. In fact, it often isn't going to work. And the real skill is turning what doesn't want to work back into something good. And it's not difficult, provided you don't see that customer as the enemy and you don't vilify the people selling or the system that was marketing as being evil, wrong or dishonest. It requires a very human approach. So again, all it came down to in the end was a balance of understanding of the different psychologies, the different views. And actually, in my opinion, when computerization came in, it gave me the one opportunity to prove this, which I did, is that if you're always talking to your customers properly and you're dealing with it in real time, you can manage all the rest in real time, because everyone remembers today. They don't remember yesterday.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. I think that's really... I think there's really some sage stuff in there, David, about managing lots of different psychologies. And that runs deep about seeing the whole person rather than being transactional about everything. So I want to just move us on because, you've given us the highs and lows and you've painted a very vivid picture for us. But then there was, we met and I invited you on a training. It was back then, it was a mediation training. And I'd love to hear about that transition and what you discovered when you came on that training. And then we'll move into where you are today.
So, very much the storybook I'm telling you was very theatric. Okay. For all that went on, we'd seen it so many times before. It was the theatre. And sometimes I used it as a theatre. And I remember I was in my 40s and I was screaming at everyone, which I promised I'd never do. I screamed and I realised I screamed my last scream. I'd had enough. It was so painful to me. I was so upset at myself for where I'd got to and what I was doing, and it was happening again. That when I found the mediation training, it opened a doorway that was like a doorway to another world. It was something I'd never heard of, something I'd never understood. Everything we did was transactional. Everything was based on fear and threat. Everything was a game of consequences. Everything was manipulation. Some of the like of which, I mean, if I told you, you wouldn't believe me, the depths to which we all played together in this manipulation. But it was uncomfortable. It dealt in dishonesty. Never ever felt safe. Used to go out to work 3-4 o'clock in the morning because I couldn't sleep. I didn't know what it was going to be next. And what I learned from the mediation is there was another language to life. It like opened a window when I realized I didn't have an internal language. We may have been effective traders, but we weren't effective human beings in many respects. We tried to be, but we tried to be human through transaction, and they're just not the same thing. I didn't understand that. And what happened is, not only did I not understand it, I had no system, process, or experience of how to use any internal humanity anywhere certainly in the workplace, because of the level of game playing dishonesty, the length of the games. These games could last years. We were all playing them. So what I realized is I could find safety. I could check in how I was feeling. I could check the temperature. I could see if it was safe. I could see if anyone could engage in a way that I never understood before. And it was a relief. To this day, it's still a relief. You with me? And it completely changed my view of the world. It changed my view of my ability to communicate in anything other than a commercial way, which in the end was successful but lonely.
So, you came on this training that I was running, and to say you were one of my most difficult participants might be an understatement, but I really saw that you wanted to get this at the core level and you wanted to test it every which way because something was shifting in you. And then we decided to go out and do neighbour disputes. You know, I needed somebody to do this. Back then, when we did neighbour disputes in social housing, they were home visits, and it wasn't necessarily the wisest thing to do home visits on one's own. So I invited you to come and do some of those with me. We saw a lot of the way people live in society, you know, a lot of deprivation, a lot of poverty, a lot of strife, I would say. And it was funny, really, for me, because I come from the street, you know, but I always, you know, had we known each other, you know, when we were younger, you would have been that posh bloke, you know. And I think that you saw something in those years, I mean, hundreds of neighbour disputes, that then moved us into the more sort of, you know, I think what we discovered was we had something. We had, you know, I created the dialogue roadmap, and we saw its use in every aspect of life. And I, you know, I'm really interested in, you know, moving now from all of that into you as a practitioner and what you see in these kind of business disputes, you know, conflicts from directors, family-owned businesses, founders, you know, those kinds of places. We talk a lot about workplace conflict, but actually if the leadership isn't communicating well, that will affect everybody.
Well, I remember the training. I remember standing up and shouting at you all the time. And I think what was going on for me is, you know, often there's an adage, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So I wanted to believe it, but I needed to test it. I still find today that people who are often in the deepest dispute, who are often painted as the most vile, virile and destructive people, they're actually idealists. When I go through it with them, they're trying to hold an ideal. It's the opposite end of the scale. So for me, yes, I gave you a very hard time because I thought this is fantastic. It's another cell. It's another con. It's just what we did for 50 years. You're with me? We sold people a dream. Whether it was true or not was another thing, or a story. So that's, I think, looking back, that's why I wanted it to work. And then we went out, and it was, from me living in my ivory tower as the controller, to actually being physically on the street. I remember the first time we went out, we were on Church Road, cars were parked all over the place. And I said, how come the police don't come down here and deal with the parking? And you said they're too frightened. And I thought, oh, okay, here we go again. It's just another end of the pendulum. But what happened over a lot of years is through being a mediator, I was able to understand my own conflict. By working with people, I could clearly see that often the subject matter of the dispute was nothing to do with the distress and upset. I could see injury, loss, harm, distress, addictions, all the things I'd seen in the business. They were no different. The group of people I was seeing were no different to the people I worked with. Some were more functioning than others, and that was the only difference. And what I found, particularly in the social housing, there were a lot of people who had been degraded, given labels and were living to them, and they were just disempowered and angry and upset and distressed. And it played out in neighbour disputes. And I was very fortunate. And I think the pivotal moment for me, fun enough, was the
It's all right, we can just take a minute. Just pick it up from the pivotal moment.
Yeah, it's proof in the end, this stuff. It does get you in the end. Right. I think the pivotal moment for me was when I did the first case with you. I set up a mediation with a family of 5 children and 2 older neighbours downstairs. And it was, for me, that was life-changing. That's where I saw real humanity, real distress, real meeting. And that's where I saw you join in, connect with, be part of. And that made the change. I'd never seen anything like that before. I'd never witnessed it. It was life-changing.
I can see it's really moved you.
Yeah, I don't know
just remembering, and it's years ago.
And I think that moment fed me ever since. It's what fed me in our relationship. It's what fed me in the work. Because what I saw is that anything is possible. What I absolutely saw is that with time, with care, with diligence, with no judgment, and just helping people kind of put it down, move away from the judgment and threat and the blame, to understand they were in charge, they do have a voice, providing they talk together. If they put it down and look at it, understand it, and figure out how they really would like to live, then there was no subject. I mean, no subject that could not be mediated or where people could change. And I think that to me is what I now call it the field of dreams. And everyone is welcome and everyone can use it. And I know that every person wants it. So when we come into the place of work, it's I think what changed it for me in the workplace, funny enough, was becoming a family mediator. Never been married, never had children. I wasn't sure we got a training. And what I realised is everyone came from a family. And again, it was changing me because I then was able to see, a lot of the dysfunction in my own family, my own upbringing, which I just thought was normal. I didn't understand, actually, it wasn't very normal. And actually there was a different structure to the world and the family and family court system that didn't really approve or allow for a lot of the things that my family and other families probably lived through. But what I realised is that everyone coming into a room, whatever room, came from a family. And there wasn't one person I met, whether we were doing relationship work or divorce and separation or contact issues or finance, whatever it was, when you saw the level of disruption, upset, distress, and their history and how they got there and whether they knew it, they understood it or not, of course this had to feed in to the workplace. No matter how much people think they can separate themselves from the work, they are the work. As much as what we do, we are the work, and our participants are our work too. So what I realised is that actually when we come into the workplace particularly, there's a huge blind spot that's developed through commerciality, industrialization, which is that you become something different for 8 hours. You sign a contract of work, and for that you lose creativity, you lose voice, you give compliance. But of course, there are minimums and maximums to how that works. And when there are imbalances in structures, when there's no, I always call them the aunt or the mother or grandma in the business that's just kind of looking after that part of humanity, things will go wrong because people will rely on contract, they will rely on system, and contract and system are not a human condition. They're not a human condition. Comes in, how are we today? What can we do today? We'll have good days, we'll have bad days. Overall, by seeing how we are together, what the difficulties are before we start work, and maybe as we're working, you'll find a different relationship. And then of course there's performance, and then of course there's change. And we live in a period of not only commercial change but world change, and people find it very hard to understand the world they're in, how to cope just surviving day to day, and then they've got to go to work and perform. And then there's a manager who's probably in a better, often, or worse place than they are, that doesn't quite know how to navigate it. There's not a language of how are we coping with this? What do we understand? Are we actually ready to do this? It's performance based. It's what's the word? It's behavioural, and people will act out and they will have bad days. So when it comes to the workplace, there's a lot of different layers. And to me, it really doesn't matter whether we're talking about workplace or anything else. What we're actually always looking at: how are you? How did you get here? What happened? What's your life like today? Did you just bury your mother? Have you got money in the bank? Are your children ill? When we start looking at what's going on and how to kind of help people de-escalate, compartmentalise, reorganise, and then have the real conversation, and that to me is the beauty of the work we do. And that, to me, is what's at the heart, really, of workplace mediation. How are you? What's going on? How did we arrive here? Is this really what you wanted to do? And let's see if we can look at what happened, how we got so upset, how it played out. And then to a point, I think with workplace mediation, there's an amount of potential embarrassment and shame that you got there at all.
Thank you. So I'm going to draw this to a close, and thank you for being so open and actually letting us see how much this touches you, because obviously I know that in our marriage. But before we go, I mean, you've talked a lot about being a divorce mediator or family mediator. You've talked about workplace mediation. You've talked about our common humanity. So as we draw this to a close, David, and I'm thinking particularly about directors, senior leadership teams, business owners, entrepreneurs, founders, investors, at that level. And, you've talked about the whole human being and our common humanity. What would you ask as a result of this podcast? What would you say is the one thing for leadership to reflect on?
Well, a business is always a reflection of its leaders, always, whether they like it or they don't. And I think looking across everything that we've done and that we do, I think it all has one common thread, and that life needs to be joyful. And if what you're doing isn't joyful, if you don't get up in the morning and think, wow, isn't this great? Look at what we're doing. Look at what we're achieving. Haven't we got a wonderful future? Or, yes, things might be changing. Isn't it great we're having the right conversations? If it isn't joyful, if it isn't fulfilling, if at any point it feels painful or testing, it's time to stop and reflect.
Thank you. And on that lovely note, I'm going to thank you for doing this with me.
Thank you.
Jesus, we're turning this into a bit of an emotional, waterfall. But I am going to thank you, David, and for doing this. And how's this been for you to be part of this?
Yes, I've well, it's the first time we've done it, so it's kind of feeling my way through it. It's interesting for me how it's kind of touched on a lot of places. And I think that our conversation really reflects the reality of what we do.
Yeah, thank you.
Sometimes we need to be able to cry.
Yeah, thank you. I love you.
Love you too.